You could feel it the moment it happened. The air shifted just a little, like everyone in the room caught the same awkward note at once, but pretended they didn't hear it. Danielle Brooks stood on the edge of the stage, waiting her turn in the line of introductions. She had shown up in a navy blazer that fit just right, hair pulled back in a low twist, calm eyes scanning the crowd. When the woman in the centre, Victoria Hale, stepped toward her, Danielle extended her hand with an easy smile. Victoria glanced at her, then looked past her. Without a word, she turned to the man on Danielle's right, laughing as she shook his hand and clapped his shoulder like they were old friends. Danielle's hand stayed out for a heartbeat longer, then she let it drop. Around them, the murmur of small talk kept going, but there was a stiffness to it now. A few people looked away, a few shifted in their seats. No one said anything. Not here, not in front of the cameras. Danielle didn't force a smile, didn't try to make it seem like nothing. She simply gave the smallest nod and stepped back. Inside, there was no flare of temper, no rush to make a scene. She had been in rooms like this before, rooms where people decided what you were worth before they even learned your name. What no one in that ballroom knew, not yet, was that Danielle wasn't just another guest at the announcement of the city's big transportation overhaul. She wasn't there for a photo op, she wasn't an assistant or a +1. The truth was far more complicated, and far more dangerous for Victoria Hale than she could possibly imagine. Because the woman she had just dismissed without a handshake was the very reason this project had the money to exist at all. And Danielle Brooks had just made a quiet decision. She would remember this moment. The morning after the announcement, the headlines were all about Victoria Hale's visionary plan for the city. Her face was everywhere, on the local news, in business blogs, even splashed across a glossy magazine cover. Danielle Brooks' name wasn't mentioned once, and that was fine by her. It had always been that way. While Victoria's world ran on bright lights and sound bites, Danielle's power lived in quiet corners. Her office was a converted loft in the West Loop, high ceilings and sunlight spilling across stacks of neatly organised files. No flashy reception desk, no wall of awards. Just a worn leather chair behind a wooden desk, a framed photo of her parents on the shelf, and the kind of silence that lets you think. Danielle didn't grow up anywhere near money. Her father worked under the hood of cars in a 2-bay garage that smelled like oil and coffee. Her mother spent 30 years teaching 3rd grade, buying crayons and notebooks out of her own paycheck when the school budget ran out. From them, Danielle learned 2 things early: work hard and don't expect the world to hand you anything. That work ethic had carried her through scholarships, late nights in the campus library, and eventually a doctorate in economics. Over the years, she had made investments that kept companies alive, saved jobs and rebuilt neighbourhoods, always without needing her name in lights. When the city's transportation overhaul came across her desk, she saw more than profit. She saw neighbourhoods cut off by broken transit lines, small businesses starved of foot traffic, and people spending hours just to get to work. She committed $400 million, nearly half the seed funding, to make it happen. And she did it without asking for a single public credit, a seat on the board, or a headline. So when Victoria Hale looked through her like she wasn't even there, Danielle didn't feel the sting of being overlooked. She felt the weight of a choice forming, slow and deliberate. Because in Danielle's world, silence wasn't weakness, it was a warning. By the end of that same week, Victoria Hale was everywhere, posing for photos in a tailored white dress, shaking hands with city officials, speaking in rehearsed soundbites about progress and partnership. She was the face of the project, the name people recognised, the one reporters chased down for quotes. At a lunch hosted by one of the city's most exclusive private clubs, she sat at the centre of a long mahogany table, sunlight spilling in through tall windows. Journalists leaned in close, hanging on her words. Between bites of salad and sips of sparkling water, she bragged about the project's incredible team and unmatched network of supporters. She rattled off names: developers, council members, engineers, all men, all white. One of the younger publicists at the far end of the table hesitated, then spoke up. "And of course, Ms. Brooks, she was there at the announcement, right?" Victoria frowned, fork paused mid-air. "Who?" Danielle Brooks, the publicist said quietly, as if unsure she should be speaking at all. She's one of the key investors. Victoria gave a short laugh and shook her head. I meet a lot of people. I can't remember every name. Anyway, let's focus on the folks who've been with me through this process from day one. Her voice was smooth, dismissive, like she was swatting away a gnat. The conversation moved on, but the publicist caught the glance of another staffer across the table. A shared look that said they both knew this wasn't just forgetfulness, it was a choice. Later that afternoon, back in her corner office with the skyline behind her, Victoria scrolled through photos from the announcement. In one frame, she was smiling broadly at a city councilman. Just off to the side stood Danielle, hand half extended, expression unreadable. Victoria studied it for a second, then clicked to the next photo without a word. What she didn't know was that a copy of that same picture had already been saved by someone else. And for Danielle Brooks, it wasn't just a snapshot, it was proof. 2 days later, while Victoria was busy giving another interview, a closed-door meeting was taking place on the top floor of the company's downtown headquarters. The boardroom was sleek and quiet, the kind of space where the carpet muted every footstep and the walls seemed to listen. One of the senior partners, a man with silver hair and a measured tone, cleared his throat before speaking. "We have a problem," he said, sliding a printed screenshot across the polished table. It was the photograph from the announcement. Victoria mid-laugh with a councilman. Danielle standing off to the side, her hand just starting to lower. The image had begun circulating online, quietly gathering momentum. Another board member leaned forward. "Do you know who she is?" he asked. A pause. "Danielle Brooks," the silver-haired partner replied. "Private investor. Her firm contributed $400 million in capital to launch this project. She's not someone we can afford to lose." The words hung heavy in the air. That afternoon, a discreet call was placed to Danielle's office. It wasn't Victoria on the line. It never is in situations like this. It was a board liaison, his voice low and careful, offering an apology on behalf of the leadership team and hinting at some misunderstanding they hoped to clear up. Danielle listened without interrupting. When he finally paused, she asked only one question. "Would you mind emailing me a copy of the investment agreement?" By the time she hung up, the document was already in her inbox. Danielle scanned it slowly, her eyes catching on a single clause buried in the middle. The investor reserved the right to pause or withdraw funding without penalty in cases of professional misconduct or actions deemed harmful to the project's reputation. She sat back in her chair, fingers resting lightly on the edge of the desk. The city outside kept moving, taxis honking, trains rumbling past. But in her office, the quiet was absolute. She knew contracts better than most lawyers. She also knew when they weren't just paper. They were leverage, and sometimes leverage was all you needed. It started with a single post. A local freelance journalist uploaded the photo from the announcement, Victoria grinning at the councilman, Danielle standing just a step away, hand awkwardly suspended in the air. The caption was simple: interesting who gets acknowledged and who doesn't. By mid-morning, it had been shared hundreds of times. By lunch, thousands. Twitter threads dissected the body language, LinkedIn posts turned it into a case study about diversity and leadership, and Facebook lit up with angry comments from residents who'd been following the project closely. One clip from the event began to surface too, a shaky phone video showing the moment in motion. Viewers could see it clearly now. Danielle's polite smile, the half step forward, the way Victoria's eyes slid right past her to greet the man beside her. The laughter that followed felt louder in the silence that came before it. Some people in the comments tried to play it down, saying maybe Victoria didn't see her. But those who knew how these events worked weren't buying it. "You don't miss the person funding nearly half your project," one user wrote. "You ignore them." By the afternoon, Danielle's name was trending locally. She didn't post a statement, didn't reply to any tags. She spent the day in her office, meeting with her small team, discussing numbers for an unrelated deal. But she kept her phone screen face down, knowing exactly what was happening without needing to watch it unfold. That evening, a reporter called her assistant, asking if Danielle would like to comment. The assistant glanced over at Danielle, who simply shook her head. "No comment at this time," the assistant said into the phone, because Danielle understood something most people didn't. Sometimes the smartest move isn't to fight the storm. It's to let it build, let the wind shift, and wait for the right moment to act. And somewhere across town, in an office with floor-to-ceiling windows, Victoria Hale was just starting to realise that this wasn't going to blow over. That night, Danielle sat alone on her balcony, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, and a mug of chamomile tea cooling in her hands. The city lights stretched out in front of her, blinking like a scattered map of every choice she'd ever made. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the low hum of traffic, the occasional wail of a siren. It was the same soundtrack she'd grown up with, constant, unshakable, like the city itself. Her mind wandered back to her first year out of grad school. She had walked into a conference full of suits and name tags, ready to pitch an idea she'd spent months perfecting. The man she was supposed to meet never looked up from his phone when she approached. He waved her toward the coffee table like she was a server. That moment had branded itself in her memory, not because it hurt, but because it taught her how quickly people decide your worth based on what they think they see. This week's Handshake snub wasn't the first. It wouldn't be the last, but it was different. This time she wasn't the newcomer in the cheap black heels and borrowed blazer. This time she held the leverage. Inside, her phone lit up on the coffee table. Another call from the board liaison. She let it ring. When it stopped, she picked it up, scrolled through her emails, and opened the investment contract again. Her eyes found the clause she'd memorized 2 days earlier. Professional misconduct harmed the project's reputation. Danielle set the mug down, took a slow breath, and began typing. The message was short and exact. Effective immediately, her firm would be pausing all remaining disbursements until a formal review could be completed. No anger, no accusations, just a statement of fact, backed by the contract they'd all signed. She read it twice, hit send, and leaned back in her chair. Out in the city, nothing had changed. Cars still moved along the streets, lights still glowed in apartment windows. But Danielle knew better. Somewhere, a domino had just tipped. The email went out just after 9 in the morning. By 10, the phone lines were already buzzing. Vendors wanted to know if their checks would be delayed. Subcontractors called asking if they should keep crews on job sites or send them home. Inside the finance department, people scrambled to figure out how to keep the wheels turning without Danielle's money coming in. In Victoria Hale's corner office, the polished calm she liked to project had been replaced by a sharp, restless energy. She stood at the window, arms folded, staring at the skyline as if the answers might appear there. Behind her, the company's top finance officer spoke in a steady but clipped tone, flipping through a spreadsheet. $400 million, Victoria. Paused, not gone but locked until she decides otherwise. Victoria turned toward him, her voice tight. She can't just pull the plug like that. We have contracts. He slid a printed copy of the agreement across her desk, tapping a single highlighted paragraph. It's right here, professional misconduct. Harm to the project's reputation. She has every right to pause the funding, and you signed it. Victoria didn't pick up the paper. She just stared at it, jaw clenched. Meanwhile, the ripples were spreading. The company's stock price dipped before lunch. A local news channel ran a segment about the investor behind the snub, playing the Handshake clip over and over. On social media, hashtags demanding accountability were climbing fast. Her public relations director suggested issuing a statement, maybe even a photo op to smooth things over. But Victoria shook her head. I'm not apologising for something I didn't even do on purpose. Down in the lobby, 2 mid-level managers rode the elevator together, speaking in low voices. If she walks away completely, this whole thing collapses, one said. The other nodded slowly. And honestly, after what I saw, I can't blame her. Across town, Danielle sat in a meeting about an entirely different project. She didn't check her phone. She didn't need to. She knew that sooner or later someone from Victoria's world would stop pretending this was nothing and start asking what it would take to make it right. And when that moment came, Danielle would be ready. It took 2 more days before Victoria finally agreed to what the board had been urging all along, a face-to-face meeting with Danielle Brooks. Not a phone call, not an email, but a real conversation. They chose a quiet hotel lounge just off Michigan Avenue, the kind of place where the lighting was soft, the chairs were deep, and the waiters knew when to stay invisible. Danielle arrived first, dressed in a tailored navy blazer over a simple blouse, hair pulled back, posture calm. She sat at a corner table with a glass of water in front of her. No notes, no assistants, just her. When Victoria walked in, her eyes scanned the room until they landed on Danielle. She approached with a practiced smile, the kind she used for magazine covers. "Danielle," she said warmly, as if they were old friends. Danielle rose to greet her, extending her hand. The handshake happened, but it was brief, firm enough to be polite, not warm enough to invite familiarity. Danielle's expression didn't change. Her eyes held steady on Victoria's for only a second before she gestured to the empty seat. Victoria sat down, placing her handbag neatly beside her. "I wanted to clear the air," she began. "There's been a lot of noise these past few days, and I think we can both agree it's gotten out of hand." Danielle didn't rush to respond. She simply waited, her face unreadable. "What happened at the announcement?" Victoria continued. "It wasn't intentional. I was distracted. There were so many people." Danielle's voice cut in, calm but precise. "You were standing 2 feet away from me, Victoria. I introduced myself. I extended my hand. You looked at me and then you turned to someone else." Victoria blinked, caught off guard by the directness. "This isn't about a single handshake," Danielle went on. "It's about what it means when someone in your position treats people like they're invisible, especially someone funding nearly half of your project." The weight of the words settled between them. For the first time, Victoria didn't have a ready answer. She looked down at her coffee, fingers tightening around the cup, and for a moment the confident public image she carried everywhere seemed to crack. Danielle leaned back, her voice even softer now. "I'm not here for an apology. I'm here to see if you understand the cost of that moment." A week after their meeting, the city's business pages carried a quiet but telling headline: "Major investor redirects funds to new transportation partner." The article was brief, almost cautious in its wording, but the meaning was clear. Danielle Brooks had officially moved her $400 million to a different company. It wasn't a dramatic press conference or a public takedown. Danielle didn't hold interviews or issue fiery statements. Instead, she let her actions speak. The new partner was a smaller, minority-owned construction firm with a reputation for fairness and a strong record of community projects. They weren't the flashiest choice, but they were respected. They hired locally, they listened, they treated people like they mattered. For those paying attention, it was a decisive move. The funding that had been the lifeblood of Victoria Hale's project was now fueling a competitor who would finish a similar network of transit upgrades without her involvement. Inside Victoria's offices, the fallout was brutal. Contracts were cancelled. High-profile partners quietly stepped back, wary of being tied to the bad press. Her project, once touted as the future of the city, now limped along with budget holes it couldn't fill. Meanwhile, on a cold morning in late February, Danielle toured the new construction site with the firm's leadership. She wore a hard hat and a long wool coat, her breath visible in the air as she walked between rows of steel beams. Workers waved as she passed, some stopping to shake her hand. She smiled at each one, asking about their families, their neighbourhoods, the commute they hoped would soon be easier. To anyone watching, it looked like an ordinary investor site visit. But to Danielle, it was more than that. It was proof that she could take a moment of disrespect and turn it into something better, not just for herself, but for thousands of people who would benefit from the finished project. She didn't need headlines, she didn't need credit. All she needed was the quiet satisfaction of knowing she'd kept her promise to invest in progress, just not for the people who didn't value it. 1 year later, the ribbon-cutting ceremony took place on a bright spring morning. The air smelled faintly of fresh asphalt, and the hum of the new electric buses filled the background. The crowd gathered along the freshly painted platform, city officials, neighbourhood families, even the press that had once covered the handshake incident like it was a sport. Danielle stood a few steps back from the podium, not in the centre of the cameras, but close enough to see every face. The mayor gave a short speech about progress and accessibility, thanking the project team for their hard work. When it was over, she motioned for Danielle to come forward. Danielle shook her head lightly, but the mayor insisted. The applause that followed was warm, genuine, not the polite, restrained clapping of a staged event, but the kind that came from people who actually understood what had been built here. She stepped up to the microphone, her voice steady, unhurried. "This project isn't about names on plaques," she said. "It's about neighbours being able to get to work without spending 2 hours on the road. It's about kids getting home from school before dark. It's about making a city work for the people who live in it." She paused, scanning the crowd, her gaze landing on a few of the construction workers she'd met months ago. Respect isn't something you offer only when it's convenient. It's the foundation of every partnership worth building, and when it's missing, the whole structure eventually cracks. The words weren't pointed at anyone, but those who knew the story felt the weight in them. When the ribbon was finally cut, Danielle slipped away before most people noticed. She walked down the new transit path, the sound of conversations and laughter fading behind her. In the distance, a bus pulled up, doors opening to let passengers step onto the platform for the first time. Danielle smiled to herself. The project was complete. The people would benefit. And the lesson, quiet but unshakable, was out there now, in boardrooms and corner offices across the city. Never underestimate the power of the person you choose to overlook. She kept walking, blending into the crowd, exactly where she'd always been most comfortable, out of the spotlight, but right at the heart of the change. Lesson: respect is not a courtesy you offer only when it's convenient. It's the foundation of every lasting relationship. One moment of disregard can cost you the trust and opportunities it took years to build. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. I'm truly grateful for your time and support. If you enjoyed it, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. I'll see you again soon here on Rain Inside.